Some betrayals don't explode. They don't arrive with the sudden, violent shattering of glass or the screaming of tires in the driveway at 3 in the morning when the world is supposed to be asleep. No, those aren't the betrayals that break you. The ones that break you are the ones that settle quietly, like a thin layer of dust on a wedding ring that hasn't been touched or polished in years. They settle like the slow, invisible rot in the foundation of a beautiful house, the kind of house you spent your whole life keeping pristine just so the neighbors would have something to envy. Tonight's story isn't about the moment I finally walked out. It isn't about a dramatic exit or the frantic packing of suitcases in the dark. This is a story about why I stayed. It is about the 22 years I spent holding my very breath just so my children could have enough air to breathe. It is about a truth I buried so deep in the thick red Georgia clay that I almost forgot where I put it. My name is Velma Morris, and I am here to tell you about the high, soul-crushing price of maintaining a perfect lie. Before we walk through the front door of that house, I need to hear from you. Look at your own reflection and be honest. Have you ever stayed in a cold room just to keep someone else warm? Have you ever sacrificed your own light to protect a child's heart? Go to the comments right now. Tell me where you were listening from, your city, your state, your country. We are building a community of survivors here, and your story is a part of mine. I'm listening.
I married Nathanial Jones on a bright, stifling spring afternoon in Savannah, Georgia. I can still close my eyes and smell the azaleas, cloying, heavy and sweet, hanging in the humid air like a thick perfume you can't escape. I remember the way the lace on my gown scratched at the soft skin of my neck, a tiny, nagging irritation that I forced myself to ignore because I was so fixated on the man standing at the altar. I was 23 years old, and I thought I was standing at the beginning of forever. Everyone in Savannah said I was the lucky one. Nathaniel was the kind of man mothers pointed to and fathers respected with a firm, nodding silence. He was handsome in that timeless, reliable way that never goes out of style. Always a crisp, white shirt, always a polite, measured nod for the elders. He worked in finance, a man who understood the cold, hard language of numbers, interest rates, and long-term security. He never raised his voice. He didn't have a temper. He knew exactly what to say in every room to make everyone feel like he was the pillar they could lean on. He was the pillar of Savannah, and I was the woman chosen to stand beside him. But there was a side of Nathaniel that didn't make it into the golden-hued wedding photos. There was a side that only revealed itself in the heavy, airless silences after the lights went out and the guests had all gone home. Nathaniel didn't yell at me. He didn't hit me. He never slammed a door or threw a glass in a fit of rage. Nathaniel did something much more surgical. He erased people. If I disagreed with him, or if I asked a question he didn't want to answer, he didn't argue. He simply acted as if I were no longer there. He would walk through a room and look right through my physical body, his silence a weapon more precise and devastating than any physical blow could ever be. I was a young bride, hungry for connection, and I mistook his coldness for strength. I mistook his lack of emotion for stability. I didn't realize until much later that I hadn't married a rock. I had married a void. I grew up in a house defined by a very specific kind of absence. My mother, Dolores Morris, was a warrior, but she was a tired one. My father had walked out when I was barely old enough to remember the timbre of his voice, leaving her to build a life out of scraps, double shifts, and sheer, raw willpower. I watched her struggle. I watched her shoulders slump in the kitchen at midnight when she thought I was dead to the world. And in my young, idealistic heart, I made a solemn vow. I swore to God that my children would never know that hollow, echoing feeling of an empty chair at the dinner table. They would never look at a front door and wonder if the man they loved was ever coming back. I was going to give them the father I never had, even if it cost me every ounce of my own identity. So when those first red flags started to flutter in the wind, I didn't see them as warnings. I saw them as tests of my devotion. I thought if I was just a little more perfect, a little more supportive, a little more invisible, Nathaniel would eventually become the man I needed him to be. I didn't realize I was building a monument to a ghost. I didn't realize that the perfect lie doesn't just fool the neighbors, it eventually starts to consume the person telling it.
The first time the foundation began to crack, I didn't hear a thunderclap. I heard a whisper. Our son, Caleb, was just 3 years old, a whirlwind of blonde curls and knees that were perpetually scraped from adventuring in the backyard. He was the center of my solar system, the living, breathing proof that I had finally succeeded where my mother hadn't. I had built a home. I had secured a father. I had created a world where the monsters didn't live inside the house. Or so I told myself every morning as I adjusted Nathaniel's silk ties and kissed him goodbye. But then the late nights started. It wasn't the kind of late night where a man comes home smelling of scotch and excuses. Nathaniel was far too disciplined for that. No, it started with the garage. I would be upstairs tucking Caleb into his race car bed, and I'd hear the heavy, muffled thud of the garage door closing. I would stand by the window, my forehead pressed against the cool glass, watching the yellow light spill out onto the damp Georgia grass. Nathaniel wouldn't come inside. He would stay in his car or lean against the workbench, his silhouette illuminated by the single, buzzing bulb above him. I could see him through the small, high window, his head tilted, his phone pressed to his ear. I couldn't hear the words, but I could hear the cadence. He'd whisper, then he'd go silent, then he'd laugh, a soft, private, intimate laugh that I realized with a sudden sharp pang in my chest he hadn't used with me in over a year. It was the laugh of a man who was being seen, truly seen by someone on the other end of that digital signal. When he finally did come inside, his face was a mask of professional exhaustion. When I'd ask him softly who he was talking to at 11 o'clock at night, he would give me that calm finance manager smile, the one he used to explain interest rates to confused clients. "Business, Velma. Just a late-night call with the London office. You worry too much. You're being emotional lately." That word, emotional, he used it like a surgeon uses a scalpel. It was his way of telling me that my intuition was a mental defect. It was his way of making me feel like the crazy one for noticing that my husband was mentally and spiritually miles away while sitting right across from me at the dinner table. Then came the gaslighting. He would tell me he'd already mentioned a late-night meeting when I knew for a fact he hadn't. He'd tell me I was the one who misplaced his car keys when he'd been the last one to touch them. Slowly, methodically, he began to make me doubt the very ground I stood on. I started keeping a journal in the back of my recipe book, writing down dates and times just to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind.
The definitive proof arrived on a nondescript Tuesday. I was doing what I always did, the invisible labor of a perfect wife. I was cleaning out the pockets of his charcoal suit jacket before taking it to the cleaners. My fingers brushed against a small, sharp piece of paper tucked deep into the lining of the inner pocket. I pulled it out, my heart starting to thrum a frantic, uneven rhythm against my ribs. It was a hotel receipt, the Grand Hyatt 2 towns over, not Atlanta where he'd been for the 3-day financial leadership conference. 2 towns over, just 45 minutes away. The dates matched perfectly. I stood in the laundry room, the scent of lavender detergent suddenly making me feel violently nauseous. I looked at the receipt, and then I looked at my reflection in the small circular window of the washing machine. I was 4 months pregnant with our second child, Naomi. My stomach was just beginning to round, a visible sign of the commitment I had made to this man and this life. I wanted to scream until my throat was raw. I wanted to wait for him to walk through that door and throw his dry cleaning in his face and tell the whole neighborhood that the pillar of Savannah was a cheap, lying, hollow shell of a man. But then the ghost of my mother Dolores appeared in my mind. I thought of the way her eyes looked when she realized my father wasn't coming back, the sheer, naked terror of, how am I going to pay the rent? I thought of Caleb sleeping soundly upstairs, dreaming of a father who was a hero. I didn't confront him. I didn't say a word. I folded that small, crumpled piece of betrayal into a tiny square and tucked it into the very bottom of my velvet jewelry box, right under the pearl necklace my mother had given me on my wedding day. I stayed silent because I had made a promise to the life growing inside me. I had sworn that my children would never grow up in a broken home. I decided right there in that laundry room that I would rather die a little bit every single day than let my children's world shatter. I would be the shield. I would be the lie, even if it meant I had to stop being Velma altogether.
Her name was Mackie Scott. It wasn't a name I had ever heard mentioned in our social circles. It wasn't the name of a client's wife or a colleague at the firm. It was a name that belonged to a shadow, a ghost that had been living in the margins of my marriage for 3 long, agonizing years. I found out by the kind of cruel accident that only happens when a man becomes too comfortable in his own deception. Nathaniel was in the shower, the steady rhythmic hiss of the water echoing through the master suite. His laptop sat open on the nightstand, the screen glowing with a soft blue light in the darkened room. I had gone to close it, to be the helpful wife, to save the battery, when a notification chirped. It was a sound that felt like a needle pricking my skin. Mackie Scott, I miss you already. My hands didn't just tremble, they went numb. The air in the room suddenly felt thin, as if the oxygen were being sucked out by a vacuum. I sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping under my weight, and I did the one thing I had promised myself I would never do. I opened the messages. I scrolled, and as I did, the 22 years of my life began to dissolve like sugar in hot tea. It wasn't just a fling. It wasn't a moment of weakness or a drunken mistake at a conference. It was an entire parallel universe. 3 years of I love yous, 3 years of digital breadcrumbs leading to a life I wasn't invited to. There were vacation photos, Nathaniel smiling on a beach I didn't recognize, wearing a shirt I had never seen. There were hotel room selfies, inside jokes about the way he liked his coffee, and detailed plans for a future that didn't include me.
But the part that broke me, the part that actually made my heart feel like it was being squeezed by a cold iron fist, were the plans for the children. Nathaniel had been telling her that he was only waiting for Caleb and Naomi to be older. He was telling this woman that I was a burden, a woman he felt sorry for but no longer loved. He was painting me as a fragile, emotional ghost that he had to care for until the kids were out of the house. He was waiting for them to grow up so he could finally be free. I heard the shower door slide open. I heard the wet thud of his feet on the bath mat. I had exactly 30 seconds to decide who I was going to be for the rest of my life. I could confront him. I could scream. I could pack his bags and throw his expensive suits on the lawn for the neighbors to see. I could be the woman my mother was, honest, broken, and alone. Instead, I closed the laptop. I smoothed the duvet. I stood up and walked into the kitchen, my movements mechanical, like a clockwork doll. When Nathaniel came downstairs in his silk robe, smelling of expensive soap and betrayal, I was standing at the stove. I handed him his tea, the steam rising between us like a veil. He studied my face with that sharp, analytical finance manager gaze. "Everything okay, Velma?" he asked, his voice smooth and untroubled. I looked him right in the eyes that had looked at Mackie Scott with a warmth I hadn't felt in a decade. And I smiled. It was the hardest thing I have ever done. "Everything is fine, Nathaniel. Just a long day with the kids." That was the moment the deal was signed in blood. I decided right then that I would stay. I would let him have his Mackie. I would let him have his secret vacations and his digital love, but I would keep the house. I would keep the Jones name, and most importantly, I would keep my children's innocence. I would be the martyr in the designer dress, and Nathaniel would never know that I had already seen through the glass. I wasn't staying for him. I was staying to make sure Caleb and Naomi never had to know that their father was a stranger. I waited 3 days to say the words. I wanted the laptop screen to burn into the back of my eyelids so I would never forget the coldness of the glow. I wanted to make sure that when I spoke, my voice didn't crack, because in the world Nathaniel had built, a cracked voice was a sign of a cracked mind. We were sitting in the sunroom, the Georgia heat pressing against the glass, the ceiling fan lazily cutting through the stagnant air. I set my tea down. The sound of the china hitting the glass table was the only warning he got. "I know about Mackie," I said. The air in the room didn't just change, it died. I watched Nathaniel's profile. He didn't flinch, he didn't spill a drop of his coffee, he didn't even look at me at first. He just continued staring out at the manicured lawn, his eyes tracking a robin as it pulled a worm from the dirt. He was a man of balance sheets and risk assessments, and I could practically hear the gears turning as he calculated the cost of a confession versus the cost of a lie. "I see," he finally said. His voice was as smooth as a polished stone. He didn't deny it. He didn't offer a frantic apology or a desperate explanation about how she didn't mean anything. He simply leaned back in his wicker chair, crossing one expensive trouser leg over the other, and looked at me with a terrifying clinical curiosity. "And what do you intend with that information, Velma?" I had spent 72 hours rehearsing my answer, but in that moment, the silence of the house spoke for me. I looked at the photos on the mantel, Caleb in his Little League uniform, Naomi in her ballet tutu. I looked at the high ceilings and the crown molding that we had picked out together when we were still pretending to be in love. I realized that if I walked out that door, I wasn't just leaving a cheating husband, I was dismantling a kingdom. "You'll never leave," he said. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact, delivered with the same cold certainty he used to predict market trends. You care too much about what Savannah thinks. You care too much about the Morris family name. And most of all, you care about those children growing up with the perfect life you never had. He was right. He had diagnosed my soul with the precision of a pathologist. He knew that my fear of being my mother, of being the woman who struggled, the woman who was pitied, the woman who was less than, was stronger than my desire for a real marriage. So, I whispered, the word feeling like ash in my mouth, what happens now? Now, Nathaniel said, standing up and adjusting his cufflinks, we continue. You keep the house, you keep the social standing, you keep the father of your children under this roof so they never have to explain a divorce to their friends. And in exchange, you stop looking at my laptop, you stop asking where I am on Tuesday nights, you become the partner I need for the world to see, and I will provide the life you're too afraid to lose. That was the birth of the silent arrangement. We became the most successful business partners in Savannah. Publicly, we were the gold standard of marriage, the couple that still held hands at charity galas, the family that sat in the third row of the Episcopal Church every Sunday morning, looking like a portrait of grace. Privately, we were strangers inhabiting a museum. I moved into the guest suite to give Nathaniel space for his late-night work. We spoke in logistics, school schedules, mortgage payments, holiday menus. I became an expert at the Velma smile, a specific stretching of the lips that never quite reached my eyes. I poured every ounce of my wasted love into Caleb and Naomi. I became the mother who never missed a game, the woman who hosted the best bake sales, the one who built a fortress of memories around her children so thick that they would never hear the cracks spreading through the walls. I stayed married so my children would never know the truth, never realizing that I was teaching them that love was just a well-maintained performance. Years began to bleed into one another, marked only by the height of the children against the kitchen doorframe and the growing stack of silent grievances I kept in the back of my mind. We were a well-oiled machine, Nathaniel and I. We moved through Savannah high society like a pair of synchronized swimmers, never breaking the surface, never showing the frantic kicking beneath the water. But time has a way of making a man careless. When you've lived a lie for a decade, you begin to believe the world is as blind as you want it to be. Nathaniel stopped hiding Mackie Scott, not in the way a man introduces his mistress at a dinner party, but in the small, arrogant ways that hurt more. It started with the grocery store. I'd be picking out peaches, the juice sweet and sticky on my fingers, and I'd see her 2 aisles over. She wasn't hiding, she was lingering. She would catch my eye and offer a small, tight smile, the smile of a woman who knew exactly what my bed looked like, even if she wasn't the one sleeping in it. Then came the church. She started sitting in the back pews, her perfume, something heavy and expensive, wafting toward the front where the perfect family sat. I could feel her eyes on the back of my neck while the choir sang about forgiveness and grace. I sat there, my gloved hand resting on Nathaniel's sleeve, feeling the heat of his skin and the coldness of his heart. I was the wife, I had the ring, I had the legal documents, but she had the man. The true breaking point, the moment the sand began to pour out of the foundation, happened at Caleb's senior year homecoming game. The stadium lights were blinding, casting long, jagged shadows across the turf. Caleb was the star quarterback, the pride of the Jones name, and I was in the stands, my throat raw from cheering. Nathaniel sat beside me, looking every bit the proud father, checking his watch every 5 minutes as if he had somewhere better to be. I looked across the field, toward the opposing bleachers, and there she was, Mackie Scott. She was wearing our school colors. She was cheering for my son. She was standing there like she had a right to his glory, like she was the secret queen behind the throne I had spent 22 years defending. That night, the silence in the car on the way home was so thick it felt like we were underwater. Caleb was out with his friends, celebrating the win. Naomi was at a sleepover. The house was empty, echoing with the ghosts of the family we pretended to be. I didn't wait for him to go to the garage. I followed him into the kitchen. The fluorescent lights hummed above us, stripping away the glamour of the evening. "She was at our son's game, Nathaniel," I said. My voice was low, vibrating with a rage I had kept locked in a box for years. "She was cheering for him as if she belonged there. Have you no shame left? Is there nothing you won't let her touch?" Nathaniel didn't even flinch. He was pouring himself a glass of water, the ice clinking against the glass with a terrifying, rhythmic precision. He turned to me, his face a mask of absolute indifference. "She didn't approach you, Velma. She stayed on her side of the field. You're making a scene out of a shadow." "It's not a shadow," I whispered, my hands trembling. "It's a humiliation. It's a slap in the face to everything I sacrificed to keep this family together." Nathaniel set the glass down. He walked toward me until he was inches away, his shadow looming over me. "You haven't sacrificed anything for me, Velma. You did it for yourself. You did it because you were too terrified to be your mother. You chose the lie. Don't act surprised now that the lie is starting to get crowded." He walked out of the room, leaving me standing in the center of our beautiful, expensive kitchen. I realized then that I wasn't a shield, I was a floor mat. I had swallowed my pride so many times that I'd forgotten what it tasted like. I looked at the calendar on the fridge, Caleb's college orientation, Naomi's scholarship deadlines. I told myself, just a few more years, just get them across the finish line. I didn't realize that Mackie Scott was tired of waiting for the finish line. She was about to bring the race to me.
The air in Savannah changed that September. The heat didn't just break, it soured. For 22 years I had lived by a set of invisible rules, a code of conduct designed to keep the peace at the cost of my soul. I thought I was the only one holding the strings, the only one keeping the marionettes moving in the great performance of the Jones family. I was wrong. I had forgotten that even the most patient shadow eventually grows tired of being cast aside. Mackie Scott had spent a decade in the dark, and she was done waiting for the children to grow up. She was done waiting for the perfect time that Nathaniel promised, but never intended to deliver. Secrets are like pressurized steam. If you don't give them a vent, they eventually blow the whole house apart. It was a Thursday afternoon, the same day Nathaniel always worked late at the firm. I was in the garden, my hands buried in the dirt, trying to find some sense of grounding in the roots of my hydrangeas. Naomi, my sweet 18-year-old girl, came jogging down the driveway. She was holding a thick, cream-colored envelope. She looked confused, her brow furrowed as she studied the handwriting. "Mom, this came for me," she said, her voice light and curious. "There's no return address, just a Savannah postmark." My blood went cold. I stood up, wiping the Georgia red clay from my palms onto my apron. I reached out for the envelope before she could open it. I told her it was probably just a late graduation gift or a college solicitation, but my hands were shaking so hard the paper rattled. I ushered her inside, told her to go start her homework, and I took that envelope into the kitchen. the room where all my biggest battles had been fought in silence. I didn't use a letter opener. I tore it open with my fingernails. Inside were 20 pages of my own destruction. There were printed screenshots of text messages dating back 5 years. There were photos of Nathaniel and Mackie at a cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains, photos where he looked happier than I had seen him in 2 decades. But the final page was the one that made the floor feel like it was falling away. It was a note written in a neat, feminine cursive on high-end stationery. "Dear Naomi," it began, "your father isn't who you think he is. He's the man who loved me for 10 years while your mother watched. Ask her why she stayed. Ask her why she chose a house over your right to the truth. Signed, Mackie Scott." I leaned against the counter, the room spinning in a slow, dizzying circle. The very thing I had spent 22 years preventing, the shattering of my children's foundation, had just arrived in a cream-colored envelope. The shield I had held up until my arms were numb had finally been kicked over. Nathaniel came home an hour later. He walked in whistling a soft tune, dropping his briefcase on the chair. I didn't say a word. I simply laid the contents of the envelope across the kitchen island like a deck of cursed cards. I watched his face. I waited for the shame. I waited for the finance manager to finally lose his composure. He looked at the photos. He read the note. And then he did the one thing I didn't expect. He shrugged. He didn't look at me with regret. He looked at me with a bored, clinical curiosity. "Well, Velma," his voice as smooth as silk, "I suppose the arrangement is over. But don't look at me like that. You knew she was there. You could have left when Caleb was 5. You could have left when the first receipt appeared. But you wanted the crown, didn't you? You wanted to be the pillar just as much as I did." For the first time in 22 years, I didn't feel the need to argue. I didn't feel the need to protect his image. I looked at the man I had sacrificed my youth for, and I realized he wasn't a pillar. He was just a hollow piece of wood, painted to look like marble. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the truth. I was ready for it.
The house had never felt so large. The high ceilings, which I once thought represented our success, now felt like the vaulted roof of a tomb. For 22 years, I had curated the silence of this home. I had muffled the sound of every argument and swallowed every sob so that the hallways would only echo with the sounds of a happy childhood. The thud of a football, the melody of a piano practice, the light-hearted banter of a family that loved one another. But that evening, the silence was different. It was heavy, expectant, and sharp as a razor's edge. I called them into the dining room. Caleb, my strong 21-year-old son who looked so much like his father it sometimes made my heart ache, and Naomi, my 18-year-old girl, still clutching the remnants of the cream-colored envelope in her trembling fingers. Nathaniel sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of absolute, chilling neutrality. He looked like a man waiting for a board meeting to begin, not a man whose entire fabricated life was about to be dismantled in front of his children. I didn't sit down. I stood at the foot of the table, my hands gripping the back of a velvet chair so hard my knuckles turned a ghostly white. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't give Nathaniel the satisfaction of seeing me emotional. I simply started at the beginning. I have spent 22 years lying to you, I said. My voice was low, steady, and carried the weight of 2 decades of suppressed truth. I have spent 22 years pretending that the man sitting at the other end of this table was the man you deserved, but he wasn't. He never was. I told them everything. I told them about the hotel receipt I found in the laundry room when I was pregnant with Naomi. I told them about the late-night calls in the garage, the business trips that were actually romantic getaways, and the messages on the laptop from a woman named Mackie Scott. I told them about the silent arrangement, the unspoken contract I had signed with their father to keep the Jones name pristine in the eyes of Savannah society. I looked at Caleb. I looked at Naomi. I expected to see the world shatter in their eyes. I expected them to collapse under the weight of the betrayal. I had spent my entire adult life trying to prevent this very moment, convinced that the truth would be the thing that destroyed them. Silence filled the room, thick and suffocating, until Caleb finally spoke. He didn't look at his father. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a weary adult understanding that I hadn't realized he possessed. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking just a little. "We knew." I felt the air leave my lungs. "What?" Naomi reached across the table and took my hand, her fingers cold but firm. "We aren't stupid, Mom. We saw the way he looked at his phone. We saw the way you two never touched when you thought we weren't looking. We saw the guest room bed being made every single morning for years. We saw everything." Caleb continued, his gaze finally shifting to Nathaniel, a look of pure, unadulterated coldness. "We didn't need you to stay in a house with a man who didn't love you, Mom. We didn't need the perfect life. We just needed you to be happy. We've watched you die a little bit every day for 20 years, and we stayed quiet because we thought you were the one who wanted to stay." The realization hit me like a physical blow. 22 years of martyrdom, 22 years of humiliation and silence, 22 years of sacrificing my own heartbeat to protect a foundation they didn't even believe in. I had built a prison of protection, and it turned out the doors had been unlocked the entire time. I looked at Nathaniel, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see a powerful man. I saw a small, lonely architect who had built a house that no one, not even his children, wanted to live in.
The sun rose over Savannah the next morning with a clarity that felt almost violent. For 22 years I had woken up in a fog of negotiation, calculating how to navigate the day without disturbing the fragile peace of our domestic theater. But that morning, as I watched the light hit the oak trees outside the guest suite window, the fog had lifted. I didn't reach for my Velma smile. I didn't reach for a mask. I reached for a pen. Nathaniel was in the kitchen, predictably calm, sipping his coffee as if the previous night's confession had been nothing more than a minor market fluctuation. He looked up as I walked in, his eyes cool and dismissive. He still believed he held the deed to my soul.
He still believed that my fear of being less than would keep me anchored to the polished floors of his house. "I trust you've had time to sleep off the melodrama," he said, not looking up from the financial section of the paper. "Caleb and Naomi are young. They'll process it. We can go to the gala on Friday as planned. A few public appearances, and the whispers will die down. Mackie knows her place." I didn't answer him with words. I simply walked to the kitchen island and laid a set of documents down on top of his newspaper. The bold black headers were impossible to ignore. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Nathaniel laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh, but a short, dry puff of air. The sound of a man who thought he was watching a child play dress-up. "You won't go through with it, Velma. You have no career. You have no independent standing. You'll be the talk of the country club for 6 months, and then you'll be a forgotten divorcee living in a townhouse in the suburbs. Is that the life you want? To be just like your mother?" I looked at him, and for the first time the comparison didn't hurt. My mother was a warrior, Nathaniel. She was honest, she was real, and she was free. I'd rather be her in a studio apartment than be your accessory in a mansion. What Nathaniel didn't see coming was the domino effect of the truth. Within 48 hours, the pillar of Savannah began to crumble from the inside out. When the children stood by me, when Caleb helped me move my things, and Naomi sat beside me at the lawyer's office, the social armor Nathaniel relied on vanished. He realized that a king without a court is just a man sitting alone in a very expensive room. But the final blow, the one that truly caught him off guard, came from the shadows he had cultivated. Mackie Scott had spent a decade being the secret queen. She had lived for the thrill of the stolen moment, the luxury of the hotel room, and the fantasy of a man who belonged to someone else. But when the divorce papers were served and Nathaniel was suddenly available full-time, when he became a man with a pending legal battle, a fractured reputation, and 2 children who wouldn't speak his name, the fantasy died. Mackie Scott didn't want the responsibility of the man. She wanted the thrill of the affair. Within a week of the filing, she was gone. She didn't leave a note. She didn't send a screenshot. She simply disappeared back into the margins of the city, leaving Nathaniel to realize that when you build a life on secrets, you shouldn't be surprised when the people you shared them with vanish the moment the light turns on. Nathanial Jones ended up in the one place he feared most, a house where no one was performing for him. He was left with the echoing silence of a museum with no visitors, while I walked out the front door and into a world that was messy, loud, and finally, undeniably mine.
Karma in Savannah doesn't always strike like a lightning bolt. Sometimes it's a slow, humid rot that eats a man from the inside out. Nathanial Jones had spent 22 years convinced that his shadow was invisible, that his money was a shield, and that his reputation was a fortress.
He didn't realize that when you build a house out of glass and lies, the first stone doesn't just crack a window, it brings the whole roof down. The divorce wasn't the quiet, dignified affair Nathaniel had calculated in his head. I didn't play by the Pillar of Savannah rules anymore. I didn't hide the hotel receipts. I didn't bury the transcripts of the messages Mackie Scott had so graciously provided. When the discovery phase of the trial began, the finance manager's meticulous books were cracked open. It turns out, when a man spends a decade maintaining a second life, he starts to move money in ways that the IRS finds very, very interesting. Nathaniel's business trips hadn't just been funded by his salary, they had been funded by creative accounting within his firm. The same arrogance that made him think he could erase me made him think he could outsmart the auditors. By the time the second month of our legal battle rolled around, Nathaniel wasn't just losing a wife, he was losing his seat at the table. The partners at the firm, the same men who had toasted him at our 20th anniversary party, began to distance themselves with a speed that was almost comical. They didn't want the Jones scandal rubbing off on their portfolios. Then came the social drought. In a city like Savannah, reputation is the only currency that matters. Once the story of the silent arrangement hit the whispers of the garden clubs and the charity boards, the invitations stopped coming. Nathaniel would walk into the club for his Saturday golf game, and the room would go silent. Men who had sought his advice for years suddenly found themselves very busy looking at their shoes. He was a pariah in a bespoke suit. But the real karma, the deep, soul-shattering kind, happened in the silence of that big, empty house on Gaston Street. Nathaniel had stayed because he liked the theater of family. He liked the perfect children and the perfect wife as ornaments to his success. Now the ornaments were gone. Caleb had moved his things out in a single afternoon, refusing to even look his father in the eye. Naomi had changed her last name back to Morris the day she turned 19. And then there was Mackie. Mackie Scott had spent 10 years playing the role of the secret queen. She had lived for the thrill of the stolen moment, the luxury of the hotel room, and the fantasy of a man who belonged to someone else. She enjoyed the drama of being the woman I couldn't compete with. But as soon as the divorce papers were served and Nathaniel was suddenly available full-time, the fantasy died. He wasn't a powerful, forbidden fruit anymore. He was a man with a pending legal battle, a fractured reputation, and 2 children who wouldn't speak his name. Mackie didn't want the responsibility of a broken man. She didn't want a partner who spent his evenings talking to lawyers and drinking scotch in a dark sunroom. She wanted the pillar. Without the height, he was just another middle-aged man with a mountain of legal fees. I heard from a mutual friend that she didn't even give him an explanation. She simply blocked his number and moved on to the next pillar she could find in the city. Nathaniel was left with the echoing halls and the dust. He sits in the sunroom now, the same room where we made our silent arrangement, staring out at the lawn that the gardeners no longer come to mow. He is surrounded by the stability he prized so much, but there is no one there to witness it. He is a king of a kingdom of one, reigning over nothing but the memory of a woman he thought he had erased.
I moved into a small, sun-drenched cottage on the coast, far enough from the whispers of Savannah to feel the salt air in my lungs. It isn't a mansion. It doesn't have crown molding or a foyer designed to impress strangers, but it has something the big house never had: honesty. Rebuilding a life at 45 is like learning to walk again after a long, heavy sleep. Every step feels deliberate. Every breath feels earned. I didn't just reclaim my name, I reclaimed my time. I started a small interior design business. Funny, isn't it? After years of decorating a lie, I now help women create spaces that actually feel like home. I don't look for perfection anymore. I look for character. I look for the beauty in the cracks. A few months ago, Naomi came to visit. We were sitting on the porch, watching the tide go out, the orange glow of the Georgia sunset painting the marsh. We had spent the afternoon talking about things we never could have discussed in the old house. Her dreams, her fears, and the messy, beautiful reality of being a woman. "Mom," she said, her voice soft and steady, "if you could go back, if you could stand at that altar again, knowing what you know now, would you still stay for us?" I looked at my daughter. I looked at the woman she had become, strong, perceptive, and unafraid of the dark. I realized then that my sacrifice hadn't protected her, it had only delayed her growth. By staying in a loveless, dishonest marriage, I hadn't taught her about commitment. I had taught her that a woman's happiness is negotiable. I had taught her that love was a performance you put on for the world, while you die inside. "No," I answered honestly, "I wouldn't. I thought I was being a hero, Naomi. I thought I was being a martyr. But the truth is, I was just afraid. I stayed because I didn't think I was enough on my own. I stayed because I wanted to prove I was better than my own history. But looking at you and looking at the life I have now, I realized that the bravest thing I ever did wasn't staying. It was finally letting the truth speak." We sat there in the fading light, two women who no longer had to whisper. The silent arrangement was dead, and in its place was a loud, beautiful, and complicated freedom. I watched the tide come in, washing away the footprints of the women we used to be.
Sometimes the bravest thing isn't staying. It's admitting you stayed too long. It's realizing that a house built on a lie is never a home, no matter how much you polish the silver. My name is Velma Morris, and I've learned that the truth doesn't just set you free, it gives you back your life. It takes a special kind of strength to hold up a world that is falling apart, but it takes even more strength to let it fall so you can build something real on the ruins. If this story touched you, if you felt the weight of a secret or the coldness of a perfect room, I want to hear from you. Tell me where you're listening from, your country, your state. We are building a community of voices that refuse to be silent anymore. And leave a comment. Should she have left sooner, or did she do what any mother would? Was Nathaniel's karma enough, or did Mackie Scott get away too easily? This is Echoes of Trust and Betrayals, where the truth always finds its voice.